Eric enjoyed taking trips out of town throughout the year, but especially during the summer. He cherished the silence, fresh air, and minimal traffic. After dropping off a client in a rural village, he would drive back along the empty road and relish in the perfect day with sunny and warm weather despite the early hours. Eric turned on some soft music, opened the window and greedily breathed in the fresh air. At that moment, he couldn't help but think if it weren't for work, he would stay and wander through the forest, enjoying the serene silence. However, it was Saturday and there was a lot of impatient clients in the city, so he needed to return as soon as possible. Mr. Park, Eric's boss, had already called him a few times, demanding that he return immediately. Being a retired officer, Mr. Park was used to expecting unconditional obedience, often not realizing the impossibility of his demands. On this particular day, when Eric received the order, he tried to explain that it would take about 40 minutes for a one-way trip, making it impossible to return within an hour. However, the boss continued insisting on being back in the city within an hour. During the trip, Mr. Park was contacting Eric every 10 minutes, demanding updates on his whereabouts and how much time he needed to reach the city. It seemed like he believed that the constant pressure would somehow speed up the process. Although the job had its merits, a good and timely salary, Eric sometimes contemplated quitting because of his boss. However, since he wasn't accustomed to constantly changing jobs, he decided to tolerate it for as long as he could. Suddenly, Eric felt that the car began to drive strangely. "Damn, how unlucky I am," Eric exclaimed out loud, realizing that he had a flat tire. He stopped the car, got out, and walked around to find that the front right tire was damaged. "Well, now Mr. Park will definitely be furious with me," Eric thought aloud as he went to the trunk. As he was about to retrieve the spare tire, he heard a child's voice from somewhere behind him. "Sir, don't worry. Everything will be fine with you. I can feel it." Turning around, Eric noticed a girl, about 5 years old, looking at him with black eyes and a friendly smile. "Where did you come from? All alone out here in the forest? Are you lost or something?" Eric asked in surprise. The little girl immediately started babbling. "No, I'm going to the pharmacy in town. My grandmother Sarah asked me to get some drops. She said her heart was racing and her blood pressure was so high, so I came to the bus stop, but it still hadn't arrived." Eric quickly realized from the girl's clothing that she appeared to be from a poor family. Her colourful dress was too big, and her knitted jacket was covered in lint balls and had lost its original colour and shape from frequent washing. "How could they let you go alone?" Eric asked, surprised. The little girl, seemingly delighted to have someone to talk to, responded emotionally. "There's no one else to go but me. Grandma is old and sick, she doesn't leave the house. And by the way, I'm a big girl and I am used to going to town on my own. Sometimes I even recite poems to people on the bus. I also sing songs and people clap and give me money. Although when my grandmother Sarah found out about my performances on the bus, she started taking the money away." Saying this, the girl turned slightly sad, but then with a mischievous squint in her eyes, she added quietly, "But I secretly bought a chocolate bar with the money a couple of times and ate it while waiting for the bus back home. And I told Sarah that nobody gave me any money. Elderly people shouldn't have sweets anyway." Eric's heart ached with sympathy for the little skinny talker. It was evident that she had no one except her sick grandmother, but she was remarkably independent for her age and accustomed to taking care of herself. The little girl interrupted his thoughts with a question. "And when you've finished fixing the tire, please give me a ride into town. I have some money saved up. My name is Hope, by the way." She rummaged through the folds of her dress, found a pocket, and proudly pulled out a crumpled bill after a couple of minutes. Eric, seeing the $1 note, smiled and gently pushed her hand away, saying, "Keep it hidden. You'll still need it. I'll change the tire, take you to the pharmacy and then bring you back to the village. You can wait in the car. I'll be quick." Eric knew that his boss wouldn't approve of this, but right now the little girl was more important to him. The man made up his mind to help her no matter what. After replacing the tire, He got back into the car and immediately noticed Hope staring at a brightly coloured pack of cookies on the seat next to her. "Are you hungry? You can have a cookie, and there's still water," the man offered, extending her a bottle. Hope happily accepted the offer, quickly opened the packet, and started eating cookies with pleasure. Noticing Eric watching her, she apologised. "I didn't have an opportunity to eat this morning, even though I cooked potatoes last night." Eric turned away to avoid embarrassing her and started the car. He decided that he would feed the poor girl in the city and buy her some food. The radio constantly emitted the boss's stern voice, demanding to be contacted, but Eric knew that even if he tried to explain, he wouldn't understand. So he minimised the volume and decided he would call back once he had safely returned the girl home. At that moment, Hope looked at him fearfully and asked softly, "Will you get in trouble because of me? Maybe you shouldn't have helped me. Your boss is yelling." Eric smiled and tried to reassure her. "Don't worry about it. I had to help you. We can't leave your sick grandmother without medicine. Let the boss yell. It's his job." He winked at his little companion, and she, feeling reassured, resumed looking at the houses and trees. Upon entering the city, Eric stopped the car near the pharmacy and offered to accompany Hope, but she insisted, with the seriousness of an adult. "No need. I can handle it on my own. Sarah had written everything on a piece of paper. I'll just give it to the lady at the window, give her the money, and then get the medicine." "Why do you treat me like a little girl? You should focus on calming down your boss and talking to him." Eric almost laughed. It was amusing to hear her speak so maturely about the situation. However, he decided to stay in the car. Hope indeed returned from the pharmacy quickly, carrying a small bag. "See? You wanted to come with me, but I came back fast, didn't I?" she asked. Eric countered by suggesting, "You know what? I'm actually hungry. It's lunchtime and I see a cafe across the street. Shall we go eat there and then continue our journey back?" Hope tried to resist, saying that the cookies she had eaten would be enough for a long time, but Eric insisted, and they went to the cafe on the first floor of a residential building. Realising that the girl wouldn't understand the menu, he decided to order according to his own taste. While they were waiting for their order, Hope looked around the interior with interest. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "I've never been in such a beautiful place. The pictures on the walls are so nice. You know, my best dream is learning to draw, and there are so many vases. And why are there so many bottles on the high table over there?" She nodded her head towards the bar. Eric answered her in the same hushed tone. "That's because men and women come to celebrate something here, and they get these drinks poured for them, and then they have fun." The girl looked at them, then at the bottles, and then back at Eric again. She asked, a little louder this time, "Can't they be funny by themselves? Do they have to have a bottle?" Before Eric could answer, a young waitress approached and placed plates of soup, a tray of bread, and utensils in front of them. Wishing them a pleasant meal, the waiter left, and Hope turned in her chair to watch her leave with an admiring look. Then she turned back to Eric and whispered again, "And even the waitress here is beautiful too. Have you seen her watch and ring?" Eric couldn't help but smile and replied quietly, "When did you have time to notice everything? Well, let's eat. I hope the food here is as good as the place itself." He ordered chicken soup with homemade noodles, and the girl ate every last drop. When the second course arrived, consisting of mashed potatoes and a baked chicken leg, the little girl timidly asked, "Is this all for me as well?" "Of course it's for you. Who else would it be for? I, as you can see, have my own portion," Eric replied. Seeing that Hope seemed somehow confused, he added, "Is something wrong? Did you not like it?" Hope quickly began to justify herself, saying, "No, on the contrary, everything is so delicious. I'm afraid I'll burst. I'm just a little girl, I can't eat too much, or I'll become fat and ugly. That's what my grandmother Sarah always says whenever I sit down to eat." Eric was already indignant in his heart. What kind of grandmother sends a small child to the city alone, takes away hard-earned money, and limits her food? Despite claiming to be full, the girl eagerly ate the chicken leg, nibbling it to the last piece of meat. but politely declined the mashed potatoes. When asked if she wanted another piece of cake or ice cream, she quietly said, "I'm sorry, but I'm sure I'll burst if I eat anything else. Thank you so much. I've never had anything so delicious. Sarah says there's no money for chicken, so she buys bones from the chicken store. The soup made from them is not so tasty, and there's no meat in it at all." Listening to the little girl, Eric marvelled at how mature and sensible she was, and how she viewed everything with understanding, from her grandmother to the world around her. After leaving the cafe, they went into the supermarket nearby. Eric stopped the girl at the entrance, squatted down to her level, and looking into her eyes, he said, "Hope, let's make a deal. You can take any products in the store, anything you need or want to eat. Imagine I'm a magician, and whatever you choose will be yours." The little girl's reaction was unexpected. Instead of the joy Eric had anticipated, tears welled up in Hope's eyes. In a trembling voice, she asked, "Can I really take anything I want?" "Of course, anything you want," Eric replied, taking her hand. But Hope, seemingly unable to believe what was happening, asked again, "For example, porridge and chicken for Sarah?" Eric nodded and said, "Hope, let's start shopping and decide what we'd like to buy." Surprisingly, she boldly took his hand, and together they entered the shopping hall. At first, she looked confused by the brightly coloured packages, but then she carefully examined everything. Eric decided to help her and started guiding her to different sections, explaining what each item was. They decided that Hope needed a few chicken carcasses, milk, 5 different yogurts, 2 large packets of sausages, and some cereal and pasta. Just before reaching the checkout, she suddenly remembered something and apologised, saying, "Can I get 1 mackerel for Grandma? She loves mackerel, but they rarely have it at our village store." Eric was once again surprised at how much Hope cared for her grandmother, despite the apparent lack of concern from the grandmother's side. Seeing how the girl wanted to please her, Eric asked her to stay with the overflowing cart while he went back to the fish department to get the mackerel. After paying for the purchases at the cash register and bagging them into 5 bags, Eric carried them to the car. Hope solemnly carried the cake in her hands, covered in chocolate, with a few cherries on top. She was glowing with happiness. It seemed that at that moment, her deepest dream had come true. On the way back to the village, Hope slept soundly in the back seat, while Eric kept thinking about her grandmother. He really wanted to see her and the little girl's living conditions. Eric had never seen any of his neighbours or acquaintances who would send their children of the same age to the store, pharmacy, or anywhere else. As they approached the village that Hope had named, Eric quietly woke her up and asked her where the house was. As Eric had expected, they were greeted by an old 1-story building, weathered by time. The windows hadn't been washed for so long ago that it was a wonder any sunlight came through at all. Eric was shocked that Hope was living in such a neglected house. Hearing the sound of a pulled-up car, an obese woman in a stretched and scruffy robe came out of the house. Just by looking at her swollen face and swollen eyes, Eric understood everything. Instead of the supposed elderly woman, bedridden and waiting for medication, there stood a woman about 50 years old who had been drinking for more than one day. Her first words, spoken to Hope, shocked Eric. "Where were you wandering, you little brat? Were you singing songs on the bus again? I'm dying here and you don't care. Did you make money? Give it to me, or you'll spend it on nonsense." The woman shouted without paying attention to the presence of a stranger. Hope immediately turned pale, squeezed herself, and stepped behind Eric. He turned around and noticed that the girl had tightly closed her eyes and covered her ears with her hands. It became clear that this was not the first time, and it was likely that the woman not only yelled at her, but could also raise her hand at her. Eric decided to reason with her and said indignantly, "Why are you doing this to the child? And why do you let her go alone? You may be her grandmother, but you have no right to yell at the girl, especially since she didn't do anything wrong. "What?" Sarah shouted, menacingly putting on a belligerent posture with her hands at her sides and taking a step towards Eric, continuing, "Who are you to teach me? Get out of here. I'll handle this girl myself. If you want to know, I'm not a grandmother at all. She should be grateful I didn't throw her out like a kitten. Her mother asked me to look after her for a couple of months and gave me some money. But the money ran out and her mum disappeared. Instead of a couple of months, she's been hanging around my neck for almost a year." Eric, who had been holding the shopping bags all this time, put them on the porch and tried to calm the woman down by saying, "Here, I brought groceries. I think you'll need them. Hope even asked for some mackerel, saying that you really like this fish." After a moment of thought, he took out some money out of his pocket and added, "And this is for your care. Maybe you can tell me how you ended up with Hope in the first place." The woman immediately hid the money in her robe pocket and immediately changed her tone. Sitting down on a chair at the porch, she began to tell the whole story. "I had a tenant. Her name was Laura. She came here with this girl in her arms and asked to stay temporarily. Somebody sent her money every month, and she had enough to pay for the room and for food. Then, one day, she said she was going to move to the city. The woman suddenly turned around and shouted at the house door, 'Hope, bring water, my throat is dry.' The little girl immediately ran over with a glass in her hands, and holding it to the woman, asked Eric, 'Can I bring all the groceries inside? Otherwise they'll spoil.' Eric nodded, once again amazed at how mature Hope was for her age. He offered to help carry the bags into the house, but the woman sharply replied, 'Don't go in there, it's messy. Hope can do everything herself. So, about her mum. She asked me to take care of the girl until she settled in the city. She said she would pay me money. I wasn't opposed, especially since it's not a bad addition to my pension. But Laura stopped sending money after 2 months and literally disappeared.' Sarah looked at Eric as if seeking understanding. 'Tell me, do I need all this trouble? I barely make ends meet for myself. My pension is pennies. And here I have to support this girl.' Eric, of course, wanted to be indignant and say that, judging by Hope's appearance, her old clothes probably cost nothing, and that such a little girl probably ate like a sparrow, but he prudently kept silent. Instead, the man pretended to sympathize with the woman, hoping to learn as much as possible about the girl and her mother. He shook his head brokenly and replied, "I understand you very well. It's such a burden. If her own mother doesn't need her, why do you need her? Maybe you have a photo of this good-for-nothing mum. I'm driving all day long. Maybe I'll see her somewhere. I'll call her to conscience." The woman seemed very glad of this suggestion, and with difficulty rising from her chair, stepping heavily with dirty bare feet, she went into the house. She had been gone a long time, and Eric had suddenly decided that she would not return at all. Who knows, he thought, what such a drunkard has in her mind. But then the floorboards creaked, and puffing and pouring sweat, the flushed hostess appeared. It was evident that every step was difficult for her. Sitting down on a chair, she held out a black and white picture, saying, "Here, it was in her things. When she disappeared, I started to pack all her stuff into bags so that it wouldn't be lying around the house. The picture fell out of the book." Eric looked at the picture and his heart raced. Painfully familiar and very favourite eyes looked at him. He immediately remembered how he had once been in love with this girl, and the feelings were mutual. Having got acquainted by chance at one student party, they literally couldn't live without each other, and were even going to get married. Eric then rented a small apartment and persuaded Laura to move in with him. He decided to save up a little money and then plan a wedding. There was no one to help them in this case. He himself was an orphan. His parents died in a car accident. So they lived in love and harmony for a little over a year, and then suddenly they had a huge fight. After a while, Eric couldn't even remember how it all started. But only after this quarrel, Laura said that she couldn't live with a man who didn't understand her, and left their apartment, slamming the door. Eric tried to stop her then. He tried to reconcile, but but she was adamant. Not understanding what he was guilty of, he nevertheless met her every evening after work and asked for forgiveness. But Laura did not even try to listen to him. And then one day she disappeared. She was not at work. At the door of the new apartment where Laura lived, he called several days in a row, but the answer was silence. Then a neighbour, taking pity on him, said that she had packed her things and moved to another city. No one could tell Eric exactly where Laura had moved to. And now he found out that his beloved had given birth to Hope, and his heart pounded even harder. He thought that Hope could very well be his daughter. Therefore, he couldn't leave her with that terrible woman in such a miserable place. He decided to take her with him. "You know what? How about I take Hope with me?" He started the conversation. "I'll buy her some clothes, get her ready for school." For some reason, Eric thought that Sarah would be happy, but it was not so. She suddenly shrieked indignantly. "What do you mean, you'll take her? I'm not giving her away for nothing. I put so much money and effort into her. Her mother will come, and I'll demand money for all the time I've been feeding her, girl." Eric was amazed at how greedy that woman was. Even in this situation, her intoxicated brain was not thinking about the fact that the girl would be taken away by a stranger, but how to benefit from this situation. Realizing what she was getting at, Eric took out his wallet, counted out some large bills, and handed them to the woman. Sarah's eyes sparkled, and she wanted to snatch the money, but Eric deftly yanked his hand away. Seeing the surprised look in the swollen eyes, he said in a formidable voice, "I will give you this money if you give me Hope for good. I will take her away and we will disappear from your life, and you, in turn, will not remember about it." The woman nodded her head again, like a Chinese dummy, as if afraid that Eric would put the money back in his purse, and quickly rambled, Of course, yes, take her away. I'll be only too glad. And I swear never to remember. Yes, you can even adopt, and if you like, take custody. I don't know what they do in cases like this. Why should I remember her? I'll be relieved to be rid of this burden." After overhearing all this conversation, Hope was already standing on the porch with a bag a minute later. "What do you have there?" Eric asked, pointing to the load. The little girl, embarrassed and looking down, timidly replied, "I'm going to live with you now, so these are my things." Eric gently stroked her head and smiled, saying, "I don't think there's anything valuable in there. Let's leave these rags here and buy you all new things." She looked at him incredulously, then at the bag, but still placed it on the floor. On the way back to the city, Eric thanked God for the opportunity to meet Hope. He had always dreamed of having a daughter or son, but his fiancée Lisa always threw a tantrum about it. She didn't want to give birth herself, citing health difficulties. When Eric suggested adopting a baby, she initially agreed, but then categorically refused at the last moment. She always said that she wanted to live for herself and that she didn't want to be tied down with children. Eric found it difficult to hear this because he had always wanted a large family with many children, but it seemed that Lisa didn't share his plans. However, now that he had met Hope and learned that she was the daughter of his former lover, and possibly his own daughter, everything was decided. It didn't matter how Lisa would react to the girl's arrival, but Hope would not go back to that cruel woman. Upon entering the city, Eric decided to stop by the office first and try to explain everything to his boss. He had minimal hope of being understood. When he saw his boss's anger, distorted face from the doorway, he realized that any chance of understanding had vanished before it even appeared. For about 10 minutes, the boss yelled at Eric, calling him irresponsible, insolent, and lazy for not wanting to work. When Eric tried to explain about the flat tire and the girl he had picked up, Mr. Park banged his fist on the table and shouted, "Stop telling me your fairy tales. If transporting beggars and homeless people is preferable for you than working on me, then go ahead. This is not appropriate for my taxi company. Get out, and I never want to see you again." Eric was actually a little glad in his heart, because he had wanted to leave that tyrant for a long time. Leaving the office, Eric realized that the turmoil of the day was not over yet. He still had to sort things out with his bride, Lisa, but regardless of the outcome of their conversation, Eric was going to formalize his guardianship of Hope as soon as possible. Before going home, he decided to change the girl's clothes. Calculating the remaining amount of his paycheck, he breathed a sigh of relief. There was enough money for a couple of outfits for Hope and their immediate needs. He hoped to find a new job quickly. Hope, waiting for him in the car and seeing how lost in thought he was when he returned, spoke up as if she understood everything, saying, "Don't worry, everything will be fine for you. I can feel it." Strange as it may seem, Eric did feel some relief at that moment. He turned to her, smiled and said, "Well, if you feel that way, then I believe you. Now let's go buy you some new outfits. I don't have a lot of money, but we can definitely afford a couple of dresses and some nice shoes." Looking at him gratefully, Hope said in a trembling voice, "Thank you for taking me away from Sarah. Don't worry, I know how to do everything. I can clean the floors, peel potatoes, and cook porridge." Eric almost cried hearing this. He reached out to stroke the little girl's messy hair, saying, "I'll take care of you myself. Your job is to be a child and go to school. That will be your focus for the next few years. Everything else will work out." They spent almost an hour in the children's store. Hope enthusiastically tried on outfit after outfit, dancing and spinning in each dress. Finally, they chose a couple of them, and also a beautiful lacquered shoe, pants and a few sweaters, a windbreaker and bunny pajamas that Hope didn't want to let go of. Before leaving the store, Hope suddenly stopped Eric, took his hand, and with a pleading voice asked, "Can I put on one of the dresses right now and ride in it?" Eric smiled and replied, "Let's first go home. I'll remind you to take a bath, and then you can try on and wear everything at once." Hope nodded in understanding and replied seriously, "I can't put it on all at once, it won't fit." She looked at Eric and suddenly burst into laughter, imagining how it would look. The man couldn't help but laugh along with her. They arrived at the house in a wonderful mood, which was quickly spoiled by Lisa as soon as they entered the apartment. Eric introduced Hope to her, but Lisa stood across the corridor, propped her arms on her sides and indignantly said, "Are you crazy? You've brought a dirty ragamuffin home. Don't tell me you're adopting her." In a tone that brooked no objections, Eric sternly replied, "Don't you dare insult the child. I'm tired of indulging your whims and waiting for you to make up your mind. The girl will live here now, and in the next few days, I'll start the custody paperwork." At that moment, Eric noticed that Hope stood there, shrinking fearfully, just like she had in the village when Sarah yelled at her. Eric took her hand and whispered softly, "Don't be afraid. I'm with you. And remember, you said everything would be all right." Lisa tried to continue the conversation by screaming, "Fine then. I'm not going to live under the same roof as this lazy little brat. It's either her or me." Eric took the frightened Hope in his arms and, pressing her against him, firmly stated, "I choose the child. The matter is closed. I hope you can pack your things in half an hour." What followed was a real nightmare. Lisa yelled insults at Eric and the girl, gathering her things in a bag. She deliberately smashed all the photos of them together, scattering them around the apartment. Seeing how frightened Hope was, huddled in the corner of the sofa, Eric decided to protect her from this nightmare. He whispered, "Why don't we run away? We could buy some ice cream and eat it in the car until that screamer disappears." The little girl nodded happily, and they immediately left the apartment holding hands. Before leaving, Eric looked into the room where Lisa was still raging and said angrily, "Don't forget, you have half an hour. If you don't, I'll have to help you, and I don't think you'll like it." Not listening to what the scandalized woman shouted after him, he closed the door. and taking Hope by the hand left the apartment. With a light heart, he was ready to start a new life, now with a beautiful child he had long dreamed of. Eric looked at Hope, and they both smiled at each other almost simultaneously, feeling happy as they walked outside hand in hand. It seemed like nothing could ever separate them. After buying ice cream, they decided to sit on a bench in the yard and started talking about all sorts of nonsense. Hope was a very curious and sociable child, and Eric was happy to answer all her questions. After a while, Eric saw Lisa storming out of the entrance in a fury, saying something indignantly to the cab driver. She hastily threw her things into the trunk, got into the car, and disappeared from Eric's life forever. When they returned home, as promised, Eric filled the bathtub with fragrant foam for Hope and went to prepare dinner himself. Despite everything that had happened during the day, he felt light and hopeful. For a whole hour, there was singing and splashing water from the bathtub. After preparing mashed potatoes with sausages and placing a fresh tomato on a plate, he called out cheerfully, "Hope, the water must be cold. Come out already." "Please," the girl pleaded, "just 5 more minutes, and I added a little warm water." When Hope finished splashing around in the bathroom, she came out, glowing, and said quietly, "I have never seen so much water. Sarah used to bathe me, but it was in a small tub. I couldn't stay in there for long." Eric smiled and affectionately stroked her wet hair. "You'll see. We'll go to the sea together." That night, Hope fell asleep almost instantly, barely touching the pillow. Eric, however, couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Laura, Hope's mother. He needed to find her. Something must have happened to her, he thought. He knew her too well to believe that she would easily abandon her child. Eric remembered how they used to dream about having many children together. He recalled how Laura used to take care of the neighbours' kids and play with them happily. As morning approached, Eric suddenly remembered an old friend from school. They used to attend soccer games together. Recently, they had bumped into each other on the street. Eric learned that Bob had joined the police force after the army and was now married with twin daughters. Thinking that Bob might be able to help him find Laura, Eric called him early in the morning. They agreed to meet for lunch. Eric shared every detail of his first love, their argument, and Laura's disappearance. He also gave Bob a photo of Laura and asked him to find out as much as possible. When Bob called and suggested meeting at the same cafe where they had met for the first time, Eric didn't know whether to feel happy or worried. As he walked towards Bob, his heart raced. He feared the worst, that Laura might no longer be alive. "Hi!" Bob greeted Eric, extending his hand. He then shared everything he had learned. Laura had been working as a housekeeper for a wealthy man for a while. "Here's the address. It's in a neighbouring town," Bob said, handing Eric a small piece of paper. "I'm sorry, but that's all I could find out. You should go there yourself and find out. Maybe she still lives there, and everything is fine. I don't have much time, and without a formal complaint, there's not much the police can do." Eric expressed his gratitude to Bob, made arrangements with his neighbour to look after Hope, and headed to the given address. The town was nearby, and within 40 minutes Eric arrived. There stood a 3-story mansion, surrounded by a tall, solid fence. Eric hesitated for a moment, but finally pressed the intercom button. A couple of minutes later, he heard a click, indicating that the gate had been opened. The voice that welcomed him through the intercom startled him. "Good afternoon, please come in." At first, Eric wondered how the owners of such a grand mansion would allow a stranger to enter so easily, but as he stepped inside, he understood. 2 well-built bodyguards in tracksuits stood in front of the entrance, eyeing him intensely. The door to the house opened, and a tall, grey-haired man appeared on the porch. "Who are you? What can I do for you?" he asked. Eric didn't know where to begin, so he explained that his former fiancée was missing, and he was desperately looking for her. At that moment, a short, thin woman of a similar age to the owner approached them. "I apologise for eavesdropping," she said in a soft voice. "We haven't been out much lately, but if you show us a picture of the girl, we might remember if we've seen her." Eric quickly retrieved the photo Sarah had given him from his inside pocket. Out of the corner of his eye, He noticed how the guards tensed as he reached into his jacket. They seemed ready to attack him at any moment. When the woman saw the photo card, she gasped. If it hadn't been for her husband supporting her, she would have fallen. Eric helped her sit down on a wicker chair, and one of the guards brought medicine and water from the house. As the woman regained her composure, her husband began to speak. "I'm sorry, but we know this young woman, and it's a very painful topic for us. Laura used to work for us as a housekeeper. We had no complaints about her work. She did everything well and quickly. But the problem was different. Our son Stuart fell in love with this simple girl, and there was nothing we could do about it. She felt the same way, and we couldn't stop them. We even laid her off, but it made no difference. They started dating in secret, as our security guard informed us. Then we sent our only son to study abroad, and that's it." At that moment, Eric's heart clenched, and he felt a pang of jealousy stir in his soul. The woman calmed down a bit and spoke in a trembling voice, filled with excitement. "If we could bring our son back now, we wouldn't say a word against their love, but we can't bring anything back. Our boy is dead. We don't know what happened exactly, but his car went off the bridge at high speed a week later when he returned." The woman fell silent, took a sip of water with a trembling hand, and continued, "We buried him, but we didn't hear anything more about Laura." The woman sobbed and wiped away the tears running down her cheeks. After saying goodbye, Eric walked out through the gate and stood there confused, not knowing what to do or where to look next. Suddenly, he felt an overwhelming desire to see the accident site and its surroundings. When he arrived at the location, he noticed that one side of the bridge was surrounded by farmland. Fields, stretching for many kilometres, were planted with various cereals, while on the other side, just downstream, was a small village. Eric didn't hesitate and he headed there. To his luck, 2 elderly women were sitting on a bench near the third house from the beginning of the village. They were engaged in an emotional conversation, but as soon as Eric's car stopped in front of them, they fell silent. Getting out of the car, he approached them with a smile and said, "Good day, ladies. I'm looking for my friend. She's missing, and her boyfriend died not far from here a few months ago. Maybe you hear or see something that could help me find her?" One of the women looked at Eric curiously, squinted her eyes and asked, "You should go to Caitlin. Her house is the last one on the right side of the road. She sheltered a strange woman, but she hasn't been right in the head. Caitlin found her on the shore, but despite trying everything, she couldn't remember her name or her family." Eric rushed back to the car, shouting with joy, "Thank you, dear ladies!" He was certain that the stranger they found on the shore was his Laura. He was relieved that she was alive, and at that moment, nothing else mattered. Approaching the house, he immediately recognized her. Laura was sitting at a table under the awning, accompanied by a stern-looking woman. They were cutting apples into a large basin on the table. Greeting them, Eric walked straight to Laura, took her hands in his, and with tears held back, whispered, "I'm so happy that you're alive." He gently kissed her hands, but when he looked into her eyes, he saw a bewildered expression. It became clear to him that she didn't recognize him. The woman sitting next to her turned out to be Caitlin, the one who had saved Laura. Watching everything unfold, she asked, "Who are you? I see that you know the poor girl, but she can't remember anything. Her memory is like a blank sheet of paper. Sit down and tell me who you are, where you come from, and what your names are. Maybe it will help jog her memory." Eric started to recount every detail, beginning with the day they first met. However, Laura showed no signs of remembering anything despite his efforts. In a final attempt, Eric decided to bring Laura to his place and introduce her to Hope. Throughout the journey, Laura was sitting in the back seat, frightened and huddled in a corner, gazing at the passing scenery outside the window. When they arrived and opened the door, Hope rushed out into the hallway and stood in the doorway. Within seconds, she ran towards Laura, wrapping her legs around her and bursting into tears. "Mummy, dear, where have you been? I miss you so much. Mummy is back." Laura started to stroke the girl's head, then suddenly kneeled and embraced her daughter, crying. It was clear that she recognized Hope. After calming them both down, Eric prepared dinner for them. During the meal, Laura avoided making eye contact with him, likely feeling guilty. Then she timidly placed her hand on his. and quietly apologized, saying, "I'm sorry for everything. Please." This gesture made him realize that Laura's memory had fully returned and that she was ready to talk, but not in front of her daughter. After dinner, Eric stayed behind to clear the table while Laura put Hope to bed. Eric didn't know what they talked about, but he was happy that they were finally together. Nervously stirring sugar into his tea, Eric sat in the kitchen when Laura emerged from the bedroom. She hesitantly sat down at the opposite end of the table. They sat in silence for a while until Eric spoke up. "You know, I'm so grateful to you for Hope. She's so clever. She sings and recites poems. She missed you so much. Why didn't you tell me when we broke up, so foolishly, that you were pregnant? She's my daughter, isn't she?" Laura suddenly burst into tears. Eric, feeling bewildered, didn't know how to react. He tried to calm her down, saying, "What are you crying about, my love? Everything is wonderful. You're alive, our daughter is a smart girl, and we are all together now. Aren't you happy? It's all in the past. It's all behind us." Laura pushed him away suddenly and whispered, "You don't understand anything. Eric, forgive me, but Hope is not your daughter." Eric felt as if his heart had been struck. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but Laura couldn't be stopped. She continued speaking. "When we broke up, I couldn't stay in that city anymore and went to earn money. A friend of mine arranged for me to work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family. From the very beginning, their son Stuart started showing interest in me. I wasn't looking for a new relationship after our breakup, but he was persistent. He showered me with his compliments and gifts, and soon we became close. His parents despised me for supposedly leading their son astray. Stuart's father immediately fired me from my job, but that didn't change anything. We continued to see each other. Then his parents paid for his education abroad. It was Stuart's dream, and he couldn't give it up. Hearing about my pregnancy, he said he wasn't ready to tell his parents about the baby yet, but he promised to support us financially and assured me that he would eventually take us to live with him. He went abroad. At first he sent money and everything was fine. Then he suddenly stopped answering my calls and stopped sending money. I was desperate because he said he loved me, and we had a daughter. I took a train to the nearest village and met Sarah there. She was a lonely woman, and I rented a woman at her house because it was cheap. So I lived on benefits and what money I'd managed to put away before. Then I put Hope in daycare and started working in a neighbouring town. I grabbed any job I could. Soon I decided to move back to the city because there were more opportunities there. I asked Sarah to look after Hope for a few months while I found a place to live and a job. One day I bumped into Stuart by chance. I couldn't help but go up to him and tell him what I thought of him. I was shouting, calling him a traitor, and he was shouting at me. That's how we found out that his parents had separated us. It turned out they'd sent him a photo of me in a wedding dress, standing with another man. And it was because of that picture that Stuart cut off all contact with me. Angry and bitter, he ordered me to get in his car, and we drove to his parents' house. But on the way, he lost control and we fell off the bridge into the river. Laura covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders began to shake with sobs. Eric approached and embraced her, saying, "What's done is done. I would like to be Hope's father forever. She and I have found a way to communicate easily. Please, think about my suggestion." Eric took her face in his hands and looked into her eyes. She nodded silently, tears running down her cheeks. At that moment, Eric caught himself thinking that he wanted to cover Hope and Laura from all troubles and misfortunes, never letting them go. Laura, as if sensing this, pressed herself against him. They were sitting embraced like that almost until morning, without saying a word to each other. In the morning, a child's voice brought her back to life. "Mummy, Eric, why are you sitting here? Don't you have a place to sleep? Why are you hugging each other? Are you relatives?" Eric looked pleadingly at Laura, and she, understanding everything without words, took her daughter in her arms and said, "Hope, it's your daddy." The girl began to jump and shout. Hooray! I now have both Mum and Dad. Super! She spun around for another 5 minutes and sang some motifs only she knew, very similar to the screams of the Indians. Laura and Eric, watching this performance, laughed and were insanely happy. In the following days, Eric thought about Stuart's parents. Gathering his courage one evening, after Hope had fallen asleep, he took Laura's hand and said, "You know, I think we should show Stuart's parents their granddaughter. You can't imagine how miserable and lonely they are. They even mentioned that they would be ready to give their consent to your relationship with Stuart. It is clear that their hearts need help." Laura didn't say anything, but the next morning she told him, "Eric, you're right. Stuart's parents have the right to know about Hope's existence. Can you take us there? I'm terrified of this meeting." Eric hugged his beloved and quietly whispered in her ear, "Don't be afraid. I will always be there for you. And as our daughter says, everything will be fine." The next weekend they drove to the place where Eric had recently learned about Laura's death. When Hope heard that they were going to meet her real grandparents, she looked slyly at Eric and said, "Let's buy them a cake, like that chocolate one with a cherry." Without waiting for an answer, she immediately continued, "And it's not because I like it, but because you said yourself that people should always visit with a cake." They all laughed at the little girl's ingenuity, but they still took the cake on the trip. As they approached the house, Laura took Eric's hand and quietly said, "I'm scared. I don't know what I'm afraid of, but my chest is trembling." He smiled and calmly answered, "Let me go alone first, prepare them, and then I will come for you." So it was decided. Eric rang the gate, and he was not surprised when it quickly clicked open, inviting him to enter. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped into the yard. Stuart's father was already on the porch and, smiling, asked, "You, sir, visit us often. What is it this time?" Eric asked to invite his wife, and as soon as she came out, he said, "I have come to introduce you to a person who will remind you of your son and perhaps replace him in your family. Thanks to your information, I found Laura, and I was very hopeful that her daughter would turn out to be my daughter. But alas, she is your son's daughter. And today I brought them here. If you don't want to communicate, just tell me right now, so as not to traumatize the child." He saw the woman's eyes fill with tears, and she took a step toward him and whispered quietly, "Where is she? I want to see her. I beg you, bring her quickly." That evening, there were many words and many tears in the house, and for the first time since Stuart's funeral, there was warmth and light in the house. When parting, Stuart's parents took a promise from Laura and Eric that they would bring Hope to visit them on weekends if possible, and they agreed, of course. A year later, Laura got pregnant, and Eric was glowing with happiness. After all, he would soon have another daughter, and there, he thought, would be several more for sure.